Okay, everyone, can I have your attention, please? Welcome to this afternoon's debate on BDS, bigotry and academic justice. My name's David Bowden. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of Ideas and co-organiser of the annual Battle of Ideas Festival in London, which Spiked are long-standing media partners of. And myself have been a semi-regular contributor to Spiked over the years. And as such, I've also organised and chaired hundreds of panels internationally over the past few years. So they very kindly asked me to come in and chair a discussion for them here today. And I'm very delighted to have taken up that invitation. I'm not going to spend too much time introducing the debate. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the controversies and debates over the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, which I can even remember from when I was at university taking part in these discussions. But obviously in recent years, it's particularly the development of the way in which it's targeting academic and cultural institutions, as well as the more formal political and economic ones, which is our focus today. It's actually quite interesting because I have done this debate many times, and I know myself I can never predict which way the audience is going to fall on the topic, and it's the kind of issue that I argue with an awful lot amongst people who I share many of the same opinions on. And of course, the kind of issues become even more confusing with the announcement this week that the government is discussing tabling legislation that would enable public bodies to be subject to legal challenge for attempting to enforce such boycotts. Quite what that means yet, we yet to see, as the legislation is not quite clearly out in the open, but it's worth bearing in mind on the context of today's discussions. Just to briefly introduce our panelists, and obviously thank you for all being here and agreeing to take part in the discussion. Just to my immediate right, we have Englert, who is a researcher in development studies at SOAS, where his research focuses on the history of the Israel labor movement. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Joanna Williams, who is education editor of Spiked and author of the recent book, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, Confronting the Fear of Knowledge. And to my immediate left, we have Barnaby Raine, who is a first-year history and politics undergraduate at Wadham College. Third year. I'm sorry about that. It came from a. You just seem to have gotten younger as the years have gone by. He's a third-year history and politics undergraduate at Wadham College and a member of the NUS Executive Council. Obviously, you sort of have to say that these days. It's great that all of the panelists are here to try and take part in this discussion and offer us at least some kind of snapshots of the kind of debate and where they stand on either side of it. I've asked and Barnaby to open up and then let Joanna to come back a little bit. That's the dynamic of the panel. I'll let them speak for an initial 5 minutes each, and I'm going to be quite strict on timing. And then I'll let them have a little bit of time where they can come back on each other before going out to you in the audience. Obviously, I know this is a very heated issue, and it's quite emotive for a lot of people. I'm going to try and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to speak. If you can help by trying to make your points as short as possible, but also waiting for your turn to do so. If people start heckling, that does just generally end up slowing down the process. But hopefully I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say. And over to you.
Oh, can Barnaby open the floor, actually?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Barnaby, are you happy to open?
I'm happy to open. Hello, everyone. I hope people can hear me. It's great to be here in the Lion's Den, and thank you so much for inviting me. I am, as was mentioned, on the National Executive of the NUS, which means that along with Ayatollah Khamenei, I am #1 enemy of global freedom. So it's a great privilege to be allowed to speak to such a freedom-loving audience. I want to talk about two kinds of freedom. First, I want to talk about academic freedom. Now, I think that there's a lot that we'll discuss and debate about the BDS movement, about whether it's effective, about the sorts of standard debates that people have. But before we start on that, I want to think about how we frame these kinds of debates. So I want to start by talking about academic freedom, and I want to run through some facts, I think, that are important when we think about academic freedom, which is the issue that has been raised today. So during Operation Cast Lead, which was Israel's attack on Gaza in 2009, 28 schools were damaged and 18 were completely destroyed by Israeli bombs. The Israeli blockade on Gaza has prevented the construction of over 100 new schools necessary to accommodate 50% of citizens who are under the age of 18. Every year, hundreds of Gazan students are admitted to foreign universities on scholarships, and many of them are not able to take up those scholarships because of the Israeli blockade. There's a student friend of mine at Oxford on one of those scholarships who doesn't know every summer whether she can go back and visit her family members, because if she does, she isn't sure whether the Israelis will let her out again to resume her studies at Oxford. Gazans once comprised 35% of students in West Bank universities. Today they're virtually absent because the Israeli blockade prevents their freedom of movement. In the West Bank, due to Israel's refusal to issue building permits, around a sixth of students in the West Bank's Area C attend schools that do not meet basic hygiene and safety standards. This includes studying in tents and in tin shacks. Nearly a third of Area C schools do not have adequate water or sanitation services. Teachers and textbooks for Palestinian students in Israel are forbidden from teaching the Nakba, the commemoration of the ethnic cleansing of over 700,000 Palestinians by the Israeli state, the act that brought the Israeli state into being in 1948. Arab teachers in Israel, and I'm sure this will shock all lovers of freedom, Arab teachers in Israel, unlike their Jewish counterparts, must receive security clearance from the Shin Bet security services before being hired. Arab schools in Israel operate under a separate curriculum determined by the Ministry of Education. Of the thousands who work at the Ministry of Education headquarters, only 10 are Arab. These are old statistics, I should say. It might have changed, but that was the case a few years ago. And lastly, this affects academic freedom, I think. A 2009 study found the Israeli government spends 4 times as much on average on the average Jewish pupil in Jerusalem as it does on the average Palestinian pupil. So those are some facts to think about when we think about academic freedom. The freedom to study, to learn of the Palestinian people has been systematically undermined by the State of Israel. And what's so important about that is that that's not a natural disaster, it's not unavoidable, it's not an accident or a mere misfortune. That is a result of the deliberate perpetuation, and this is what angers so many activists all over the world. It's not just a result of poverty or of a famine, which is caused by some natural cause. Those sufferings of the Palestinian people, suffering since 1948, are the result of the deliberate perpetuation of injustice along ethnic lines by the State of Israel. In the West Bank, what roads you can travel on, what schools you can go to, whether your village is connected to the electric grid, whether it's connected to decent roads, all of those things are determined by your ethnic origin. In Israel proper, there is a law of return, which means that I, because I'm Jewish, though I have no connection at all to the land of Israel, I'm allowed to go and live there tomorrow, but Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes in 1948 are forbidden from returning. Access to housing and other services is determined in part by whether you've served in the military, which systematically excludes Palestinians. Your ability to marry freely is systematically undermined because, for example, if you're a Jerusalem Palestinian and you want to marry a West Bank Palestinian, you're not allowed to live in Jerusalem. 13% of land at the last count within the State of Israel. The nice bit of the State of Israel, we're told, not the occupied territories. The bit of Palestine that's been occupied since 1948, not merely since 1967. 13% of land at the last count is owned and controlled by the Jewish National Fund, which has a rule which says that it can only be bought and sold by and to Jews. We wouldn't accept that. I, as a Jew, wouldn't accept that if there was a law in France or in Britain or anywhere else that said that 13% of land couldn't be sold to Jews, but somehow people think it's acceptable when a law says land can't be sold. A large chunk of the land of the state can't be sold to Arabs. And of course, in Gaza, people are besieged and regularly bombed merely on account of their ethnic origin because they are Palestinians, they're victims. It doesn't matter whether the child who's killed has voted for Hamas or not. So, what offends people about the State of Israel is its deliberate perpetuation of injustice along ethnic lines, and we shouldn't think that that somehow doesn't affect the academic freedom of millions of Palestinians. It certainly affects the freedom also of millions in refugee camps who are denied a proper education.
Shh. Don't, please. We'll come out to the audience later.
But I want to finish by saying something else, something broader about freedom, and I'll be delighted to respond to you later, which is about the kind of freedoms that people like Spiked are concerned about. Because I'm very worried about a new intolerance on campus. I'm very worried about government legislation which is going to ban student unions and others from taking part in boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns. I'm very worried about a government prevent agenda which has seen a boy taken out of his class in school for wearing a badge saying he supports the people of Palestine. I'm very worried about the cooperative bank closing the bank accounts of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and yet we have a conference today about the new intolerance on campus, and it's talking about students organizing to keep out extremists, and it's talking about the academic freedom of a few Israeli academics, and not the systematic undermining of the academic freedom of the Palestinian people, and the real threats to academic freedom in this country which exist with the government's counter-terror legislation, the real threats to freedom which exist with broad government legislation. So I'll just finish by saying this. I'm concerned about freedom, not the freedom of the schoolyard bully to harass and assault, not the freedom of the South African cricket captain to play abroad without being boycotted. I'm concerned about the freedom of the marginalized. I'm concerned about the freedom of the Palestinian people and activists in this country to be able to show legitimate dissent and to speak up for the Palestinians. And I hope Spiked will join me in those battles.
Thank you. Okay, Si.
Thank you. First of all, apologies for being late. I was at a university far away, so I had to run over. I thought I'd start maybe with a preemptive strike, if you allow me the pun, which is to try to deal with some of the criticisms that are usually leveled against the BDS movement. I feel we probably start here with a general knowledge of where BDS has come from, and so I thought we'd get right into the argument. One of them is, as people might have seen in a quite interesting debate on Channel 4 News the other night, is that boycotts are ineffective, that they do nothing, that we really shouldn't bother. Which is interesting, of course, to have a debate about a subject on national TV while being told that the reason you're having the debate is that it's a really ineffective method that you shouldn't worry about. This summer, we saw a couple of interesting developments. One of them was that after the National Union of Students here in Britain voted to support the boycott movement, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, took to the international stage to condemn the National Union of Students. So ineffective is the movement that he is worried by a student union somewhere in Britain passing a resolution that it encourages students to join a movement, which worries him as the head of, we hear, the only democracy in the Middle East. Further, a couple of months later in the summer, the Israeli government leaked an internal discussion document that pointed to the fact that they believe they will lose in boycott activity more money than what they receive annually from the US government. Hardly an ineffective movement. Thirdly, on the question of effectiveness, I'd like to point to the case of Veolia, a company that was complicit in linking the transfer of population from West Jerusalem to the settlements in the East. I see people are rolling their eyes. I'm afraid it is an illegal transfer of population. You can take it up with the International Court of Justice if you like. A company that was boycotted in local councils, a company which decided to pull out of that contract since it's been targeted by boycotts. Indeed, local councils that are now being targeted by our government which will announce the full scale of its plan while it is in Israel, just in case anybody has any illusion of the political significance of the move. The second one is that we're shutting down progressive voices, those thundering voices of the progressive Israeli left that are fighting against this rising right-wing government, struggling to have themselves heard. Well, I spent the last 7 months in Jerusalem for my research and was there for the growing confrontations in October between Palestinians and the Israeli army. Something which is interesting, which is that the Israeli army has now decided to target specifically universities in measures of collective punishment. Every single time somebody who is accused of terrorism is gunned down in East Jerusalem or the West Bank, the policy now is to raid the university campus. So I found myself in October working with Palestinian academics who on a daily basis, maybe not a daily basis, that's a slight exaggeration, several times a week for a month and a half, had to cancel meetings, cancel classes, make sure that students were making it home safe while the Israeli army was entering Al-Quds University 7 times in 2.5 weeks, was targeting it on both sides of the Green Line, was shutting it down, was shutting down Hebron University, was continuously targeting spaces of academic learning. And I was waiting for those progressive voices in Israeli academia that I'd heard so much about. I was waiting for them to come out and to speak in solidarity with their colleagues on the other sides of the Green Line, to say that this right-wing government that we here is targeting those academics was really out of line. And as for every single attack on universities, whether it's that of the Islamic University in Gaza, which has been carpet bombed several times, or those intrusions in universities, which we see all the time in the West Bank, we were met with deafening silence. And finally, on the question of shutting down free speech, I want to, and that this will stop us finding a resolution. There is a famous saying that power concedes nothing without power, and the idea that discussions will get us there, I am slightly skeptical about. But I'd like to say I'm up for open discussion. I campaigned for academic boycott at SOAS University, a fantastic referendum which we won, and then organized a conference on Israeli society at which we invited a lot of Israeli academics. We didn't invite the funding of their institution. I'm up for having them in the room, but I'm up for having them in the room on a clear basis, that they're not there to represent their government, they're not there to represent institutions which further segregation and apartheid, and that we're there in a neutral space in which we'll do everything possible to give real academic freedom, both to everybody involved in the discussion, and that means that we have to tell the balance to those who are continuously being silenced and pushed out structurally of any access to academic spaces and debates. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna.
Okay, I want to begin with a quote from Nelson Mandela when he was released from prison and addressing the ANC. He said, "In some cases it may be correct to boycott, and in others it might be unwise and dangerous." And I want to outline 4 reasons this afternoon why I think academic boycotts against Israeli universities are both unwise and dangerous. I want to argue that BDS is censorious, that BDS is dishonest, that BDS is bigoted, and that BDS is fundamentally counter the principles of scholarship. Give me a chance. So, BDS is censorious. I think just think about this for like 30 seconds, and there's a real irony in the idea that a campaign to promote freedom begins by calling for bans and censorship and boycotts. There's kind of completely illogical that you would try to promote freedom by boycotting, that you would try to promote academic freedom by arguing who can and who can't take part in discussions. So the whole idea that we don't cooperate, that of a boycott, that you don't cooperate with Israeli academics and Israeli universities, involves passing a political judgment on who gets to speak, dependent upon either the nationality or the viewpoint of the speaker, and that is fundamentally censorious. It involves somebody else sitting in judgment and deciding, you come from the right nation, you have the right views, therefore you can speak, and you can't speak. And I think that act of passing judgment in that way, of deciding who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak based upon nationality or based upon political viewpoint, is really censorious. I think BDS is very dishonest, and I think we've had a very good illustration from Sai as to the nature of this dishonesty, to say, I don't mind having Israelis in the room with me. Well, that's very good of you, thank you. I don't mind having Israelis in the room with me, I just don't want to take money from their institution. It kind of, again, it's another real hypocrisy to the BDS movement. I mean, BDS people are always kind of campaigning about how much they don't like neoliberalism. You know, it's really been placed in the context of a broader social justice movement. But to say, oh, I'm quite happy to have Israelis in the room with me, but I don't want their money, is kind of like real pretense about the way that academic life works. Conferences, travel, publications are very expensive. And if you're saying, well, you can come as an individual, this kind of neoliberal individual that everybody detests so much, but we won't let you be funded by your institution. I mean, that's just farcical, because really what you're saying then is that they can't come at all, and you may as well be honest about that. I think BDS is fundamentally dishonest because it passes censorship off as protecting free speech. It pretends to be promoting justice. It, like I say, has positioned itself as central to intersectional movements for justice more broadly, but actually scratch the surface and it is completely opposed to free speech. So Stephen Slater, who I'm sure lots of you in this room will have heard of, who's a big leading proponent of BDS in America, has argued that boycott is not a contravention of academic freedom, but an expression of it. Now, the only thing that comes into my mind when I hear that is, well, is that like how book burning is an expression of academic freedom as well? Do we promote free speech by burning books? I mean, it's just fundamentally bizarre to argue that boycott is not a contravention of academic freedom, but an expression of it. Third point, BDS is bigoted because it targets Israel as exceptional for all kinds of reasons, whereas the Israeli state is not exceptional. Again, if you go back to the point that I made first of all, BDS is arguing that political judgments about the nation and the viewpoint of the individual should be put in place on who gets to speak. Well, if that's the case, and if we're really going to follow through the logic of that argument, you know, Saudi Arabia, China, America, drone strikes, UK has been involved in all kinds of military interventions around the world. Why target just one country when there are lots and lots of other countries that also do very bad things? I think, again, this comes down to the BDS is dishonest because actually the aim of the BDS movement is to propagate this notion of collective guilt, which I'm very opposed to. I don't think all Israeli academic scholars and students need to carry the burden of national collective guilt in the way that scholars from America, the UK, China, and Saudi Arabia don't have to. If the BDS campaign is being honest, then actually its aim is to delegitimate the state of Israel. Really what they're arguing is that Israel has no right to exist. And this is where the comparisons with South Africa, which, you know, perhaps is something that we could pull upon, I won't go into too much now, but perhaps we could come back to in the discussion, is actually really illegitimate when those comparisons are made. Finally then, I think the BDS campaign is fundamentally opposed to scholarship because it places politics above objectivity. It forces people to adopt political positions. It makes no pretense that it's interested in a search for truth or objectivity. It curtails criticality. It reinforces conformity. It argues that, it prevents opposing views from being heard, and it judges, it actually places at the heart of academia this idea that the worth of knowledge is not based on any objective measure as to whether knowledge is, whether we can test out what the relationship of knowledge is to truth, whether knowledge is objectively worthwhile or not. But it places at the heart of academia this idea that the worth of knowledge is dependent upon the identity of the originator. So whoever is speaking, that's the basis on which we should judge knowledge. And I think, as soon as you place that view at the heart of academia, then you fundamentally degrade scholarship. I think it's really damaging, this idea that BDS is most popular among the humanities. I think it completely trivializes study and research in the humanities, that it's become distanced from scholarship and completely subsumed into political campaigning. But let's be careful here about which way around this is happening. It's not the case that BDS is providing a unique attack upon scholarship. The fundamental attack upon the Enlightenment, upon Western values, has been going on in universities in the West for decades now. It's just the case that BDS is the most concrete form that this takes. And you can see how the existence of the state of Israel, if you like, as a construct of the West, as representative of Western values, is a real kind of slap in the face. The very fact that it exists is a slap in the face to scholars who are so fundamentally opposed to everything that the Enlightenment stands for. I'll leave it there then. Just final comment then. In my mind, I think there are problems with the way Israel has conducted itself over the past few years. Some problems. I think the problems are not unique to Israel. I think, you know, you could look at foreign policy issues in many countries around the world. But I think the answer to these, well, one answer to these problems is more freedom, not less. It's more debate, not less. It's more international dialogue and cooperation, not less. To my mind, BDS, you know, it should stand for bigoted, dishonest, and stupid.
I'm going to try and go out to the audience as quick as possible, but Barnaby and Si, I don't know if there's anything you just want to briefly pick up on, or happy for me to go straight out to questions? You're not?
I mean, there's lots to pick up on, but I'm sure that lots of people want to have their say, and we'll come back. Yeah.
Okay, then I'll go out for some questions. A reminder. Okay, if there's I don't know who has the mic. I think maybe let's just try and work our way forward from right at the back there. There's no great science to taking questions.
Hi. I think that there are lots of reasons for thinking that the BDS, and especially the boycotting of Israel, is inconsistent for all sorts of reasons. Not least, as Joanna said, that it seems to exceptionalize Israel as this kind of absolutely monstrous, terrorizer of the world compared with other, particularly Western imperial countries. But that said, whilst the boycott might be inconsistent, I think that opposition to the boycott is also prone to inconsistency. Just because we can express complaints about the BDS movement, it doesn't follow that if we can't do at least some good in the BDS movement, that we shouldn't even try. Therefore, whilst BDS might be inconsistent, and I think should be critiqued for being so, I think it's also inconsistent to absolutely try and shut the whole thing down.
Okay, and I think there's a chap just in front, I think, who had his... Yep.
Thank you. Barnaby seemed to be evoking the concept of collective guilt. So you said that Israeli academics were schoolyard bullies, and that therefore by banning them from participating, you were in some way empowering those who you claim are marginalized. And it seems to me there's a kind of analogy here with the sort of arguments that fascists used to make in the 30s, that the Jewish community were an incredibly powerful group, and that by suppressing their individual freedoms, this in some way created greater justice for the Volk. And I think there's a huge danger here in collectivizing the issue of free speech, because this then opens the door without any restraint to the suppression of the rights of individuals, regardless of which particular ethnic, religious, or other categories they come from.
Okay, there was another hand just around you. Is there a mic on that side of the room as well, or is there? Yeah. Do you want to just pass it to that person just sat on that side, because that's how I got big and order. But over here first. This side.
Hi. Some of the arguments from Barnaby about the negative effects on Palestinians from Operation Cast Lead or from the blockade, that's then used to immediately imply that that is all Israel's fault. Therefore, it's not a legitimate security operation, or they're not in any way reluctantly being forced to do this. There is no responsibility for the reasons they think Cast Lead and the blockade needs to go on. So therefore, for BDS to give up, for it to say, our work here is done, they're requiring Israel to necessarily empower those people who want to kill them. There's no way around this. There is no legitimate security operation Israel can undertake. The BDS will not look at the results of and say that is Israel's fault, not to blame Hamas or any of the other motivations for them doing it in the first place.
Okay, so there's somebody with the mic over there. Do you want to just pass it to that person in blue? Yep, just there, but the person standing up over here first.
I just wanted to spell out the position that those of us who are jobbing academics can be placed in by the kind of pressure that emanates from this boycott. I've been subject to this twice in relation to conferences I've organised at the University of Kent, the subject matter being family policy and reproductive technologies, where members of the union, of which I should say I'm a member, the University of College Union, have asked me to remove speakers from programmes because they are Israeli. You just think about the position that puts me in. These are serious scholars who have done very important research about a matter that's actually extremely interesting, to refer to Joe's point about the way this undermines the pursuit of knowledge. Because on these areas to do with reproductive technology, as it happens, there's a lot of very interesting things that need to be discussed about Israel. So the proposition now from my union is that I then say to these people, I'm sorry, even though you've done brilliant research, even though you're really interesting, I'm going to take you off the programme and say you can't come because you work in Israeli university. I think the position that you place me in is actually to make me an anti-Semite. That's the only way that I can interpret what you're saying. Because essentially, I have to say to these people, I'm sorry you can't come because you're a Jew. Now, whatever you say about the situation that's going on there, there is absolutely no way that that could ever be compatible with any association with freedom, tolerance, or any such idea. It is simply intolerant and untenable.
We'll take that person over there. There's one more person in the middle, then we'll come back for some responses and I'll go back out again. So you first.
Thank you. What happened at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival last year with the Israeli theatre group that was shut down by the BDS 2 years ago, 2014, yeah. I think that was particularly dangerous because the idea behind it is that artists, individual artists who are not representatives of their own state, are trying to share an idea, and they're using the arts to do it, which we have the Enlightenment values, we've got a great tradition of sharing ideas through the arts. The excuse leveled against them and the BDS legitimizing their own protest was that they received money from the Israeli version of the Arts Council or the theatre fund. So therefore, they are a legitimate target against any kind of protest. Now, one of the prominent voices against this at the time, and this is an example of how dangerous this idea is, was Ken Loach, who has received money to make films from the BFI and from the British taxpayers, and he received money to make movies while this state was engaged in its own wars, and some might say the Prime Minister of this state was engaged in war crimes. So are we to say, let's ban Ken Loach's movies in the future because he's received money from a state engaged in warfare?
Okay, so does it take this? Okay, and then I'll try and come down the front after they've had some responses. But you.
To what extent do the panel feel that singling out Israeli nationals in this way contributes to the sense of right-wing paranoid nationalism that is surely the root cause of the suppression of Palestinians in the first place?
Okay. Do you want to pick up on anything? There's quite a few things. Si?
There's quite a few things I'd like to pick up on. I mean, first of all, I think we have to be serious. I can't comment on individual cases, but guidelines are very clear everywhere about the question that we're dealing with institutions, not individuals. It's not a lie, it's not dishonest. I'll tell you how we funded Israeli academics to come to SOAS. There's long articles denouncing us for using collaborators against the state, etc. in our conference. So there's a lot of information online. We funded them. We invited them, we funded them, we told them to come. So I think we have to be serious and actually deal with what's going on. Then the question of censorship. I'm sorry, I don't think that people in universities, communities, schools, etc. are taking collective decisions about who they want to give money to, who they want to give credence to, who they want to work with and be associated to, is censorship. That's simply a democratic decision. A state, on the other hand, deciding what kind of democratic decision we're allowed to take or not, that, on the other hand, should perhaps worry us a little bit more. And so I think we have to be clear about censorship, about the structural nature of the questions that we're facing. A movement that around the world is asking civil society to take decisions in their own institutions and communities is being equated with a state that is spending billions of dollars to encourage people to travel the world, to take part in what they see as an information and propaganda war. This is not something that is being invented by the BDS movement. This is something that is being encouraged by the states. People that travel to Israel might know that there are panels in Hebrew in the airport reminding people to take part in that argument and in that propaganda war. This is not something that is being invented. Now, on the question of ideas, I'm sorry, I'm not taking ideas as my starting point, and I want to be honest about that. I'm trying to deal with structures and political processes. Haifa and Tel Aviv University have direct contacts with the intelligence services in Israel and train their officers. Haifa and Ben Gurion University develop arms and electronic devices that kill and massacre entire populations. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem is built on land which has been confiscated after, a part of it I should say, is built on land confiscated after 1967. I mean, the whole of Jerusalem is beyond the 1948 line, so all the huffs in the room are perhaps not so appropriate. Has links with Ariel University in the West Bank and gives them validation. During the war on Gaza, decided that its way, and I quote, to contribute in the national war effort was to give soldiers who took part in the massacre of civilians a free ride at university. And finally, it trains as well intelligence officers. We are not dealing with ideas that might be nice or interesting or kind of good. We are dealing with institutions which are collaborating on a daily basis to the destruction of an entire people. And so finally, on the question of where do we lay blame, of course we lay blame on a colonial entity which has spent the last 70 years and has developed it, in those words, to develop a state on ethnic bases. So it's not about whether it has the right or not to exist, it's whether we think that in this world we believe it is right for a state to be constructed on ethnic basis. And I don't think so. And why do we imply a boycott? Because the Palestinians who are the victim of this ethnic purity are the ones who called us to do it. If Shias in the east of Saudi Arabia tomorrow called on us to boycott Saudi Arabia, I'll come to your conference and I'll speak in favor of boycotting them as well.
Okay. Joanna?
Just listening to that list there of all the sins of the state of Israel, and it did occur to me, that there's not one thing on that list that some other country hasn't done in relation to universities elsewhere. I mean, I think very naive of us to think that all national economies don't have links between, don't fund universities on the basis that they're going to get something out of it, either for their military or their industrial. That this is what goes on. Just thinking, even just after the Second World War, the American GI Bill provided a free route to returning American soldiers to universities. So all of these things have happened elsewhere. Again, we come back to this question of why is Israel then held up as exceptional, and however long a list of things that you might rattle off that Israel is guilty of, it doesn't, I'm afraid, explain the exceptionalism. On the fact that Palestinians have called for the boycott, well, people call for all kinds of things, and I'm afraid there's part of me just thinks that's tough. We don't do everything and respond to everything uncritically. I mean, go back to the Mandela quote that I started with. We need to remember that boycott's a tactic. It's not in and of itself a principle or a political stance. It's a tactic that you would use in certain circumstances, and you would make a decision whether that was a good tactic or a bad tactic appropriately. Just to respond to some of the comments that came out from the audience, I think it's really important and kind of deeply worrying and upsetting, the comment that was made from the back there about UCU asking for particular Israeli academics to be withdrawn from conferences. The thing that really upsets me about that is it just provides such a great example and such a revealing example of how academics in this instance are setting the example to students about campus censorship. Academics are telling students quite explicitly in such instances, and there's been other cases at Warwick University where people have pulled out of a debate because an Israeli spokesperson was invited. They are very, very explicitly then telling students two things. Firstly, they're telling them that the way to deal with people or ideas or points of discussion that you don't like is to shut them down, is to not engage, is to censor these ideas, is to refuse to participate in them. I think it's hardly surprising then if students pick up this idea that that's the right way to conduct yourself in a debate, is to withdraw from it, not participate if you don't like the nationality or the person or the ideas that you're going to be expected to debate against. And I think that's very, very unhelpful. The second thing I think that this does in the eyes of students is it completely sends out this message that you can redefine censorship as justice. You can redefine academic freedom as the opposite. You can redefine freedom as censorship. That it sends out to students that the way you promote free speech is by restricting free speech. I mean, it's again, to repeat the points I said at the beginning, it's dishonest, it's bizarre, it's frankly stupid. A final comment on the banning BDS thing, which is the latest thing that's come up over the course of this few days. You know, I, as people might have gathered, I'm not a big fan of BDS, but I don't agree either with banning BDS. I mean, again, it's just a kind of ludicrous example of banning a ban. You can't make bad ideas go away or bad practices go away by banning them. That said, you know, I would never ever support banning BDS, but I do have sympathy with the call to stop BDS because lots of the calls for BDS are anti-democratic. If you look at local councils, if you look at universities, they operate these BDS policies on behalf of their members when maybe a tiny proportion of the population have voted for them, and they haven't been posed specifically on the issue of BDS. So I think a lot of the BDS movements that are operated, that are enforced, are fundamentally undemocratic, but I don't think that necessarily means, or I don't think that means that we should ban BDS.
Okay. Barnaby?
Thanks. I want to come back on two issues. The first one that's been taken a bit, but I want to say something else, and the other one that hasn't been discussed up here. So first on the issue of censorship. I want freedom, dignity, and security for every single human being who lives in Palestine, in historic Palestine, whether they are Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Druze or Bedouin or anything else. But freedom, as Sy said, quoting the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, freedom takes a struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. So if we want freedom for all, we have to address a certain concentration of power which is materially preventing the achievement of that freedom. A concentration of power which in 1948, when the State of Israel was born, ethnically cleansed the land of most of its indigenous inhabitants. A concentration of power which continues illegally to occupy the territories known as the West Bank and Gaza, and which systematically undermines human rights, including, as I said, academic freedom. And by the way, if you think, as was said in the audience, that Israel just has no partner for peace, that the Palestinians have just never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, that Israel really wants a peaceful, viable two-state solution, but the Palestinians don't. Just look at the vast amount of leaked material that formed the Palestine Papers, in which we see what happened in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, and we see that the Palestinian National Authority, a kind of Vichy regime in the West Bank, was prepared to give up enormous amounts to the state of Israel, prepared to give up most of jurisdiction over Jerusalem. And yet, Ehud Olmert, who's now regarded in Israel as well as being, of course, a corrupt crook, as a kind of peacemaker and a dove, turned down that offer, as did Tzipi Livni turn down those kinds of offers. So the record from behind the scenes is absolutely clear. It is the state of Israel which has continued to undermine drives for freedom. Between 1948 and 1967, Palestinians living within the State of Israel lived under military law. They didn't have even basic human rights. Since then, Israel has illegally occupied part of Palestine and didn't accept the two-state solution, even theoretically, until very recently, and in practice, they never have. So if we really want freedom for all, if we value the academic freedom of Israelis and Palestinians, we have to struggle in order to overturn that power, which is frustrating. That in exactly the same way as if you want freedom for everyone in South Africa, you had to accept that a South African cricket captain wouldn't be able to go and play overseas. And that was sad for that South African cricket captain. But frankly, it was more important to ensure that the vast gaping wound of South African apartheid was healed. Lastly, I want to say something about the allegation of anti-Semitism. I'm extremely proud that we as Jews, I think this might be a controversial claim, gave the world... Did people hear that? He said, don't say we when you're a capo, referring to Nazi concentration camp guards. I'm very proud. I'm going to respond to that because I think it's important. So he compared me to a concentration camp guard, which is profoundly anti-Semitic. I'm very proud. That doesn't...
Can we let...
I'm very proud...
on the platform, we go back out later, okay?
I'm very proud that we gave the world, I think, the basis of human rights. It was Hillel the Elder who said, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. That is the basis of Jewish values. It's the basis of universal values. I'm extremely proud of that. I'm extremely proud that Jews have been at the heart of campaigns for international justice, for peace, for human rights, including for the Palestinian people. That people like Hayo Meir, an Auschwitz survivor, could say extremely clearly, you can't be an anti-racist unless you're an anti-Zionist. It is hypocrisy to say that you oppose the dispossession of human rights for Jews, but you're okay with ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and occupation when it comes to the Palestinians. So I just want to say this to people who are Jewish and to people who are not Jewish. You demean Jewish history and Jewish values when you line up with anti-Semites to allege that there is no difference between the criminal policies of the Israeli state, between the political idea of Zionism, which has always been contested in Jewish history, it's only appeared relatively recently, and the Jewish people. To line up with neo-Nazis and other fanaticists and say that there's no difference at all between Zionists and Jews, to do what Netanyahu did when he addressed the US Congress and said that he was speaking on behalf of all Jews, though I never had the chance to vote for him, that is offensive. It demeans Jewish history. Please, please, please have the courage to make your arguments and don't do that.
I'm going to let Joanna get in quickly, and then I'm going to go... okay, you're fine. Obviously, this is a discussion primarily about academic freedom, and people feel free to exercise it. Just on questions, there's a couple of people sort of towards the back there on that side, if you could take. There's someone in the back row who's been waiting for a little while.
Well, firstly, Sai, I'd like to ask if you feel the need to hold any kind of responsibility or guilt for the fact that SOAS, your institution, was founded and still done in certain instances, act as a training school for intelligence officers.
Absolutely.
And secondly, Barnaby, you yourself used the word, you described the PNA, Palestinian National Authority, as being a kind of Vichy government, a Vichy regime. I'd like to ask if you think perhaps the kind of political circumstance and situation of the Palestinian people might be better helped by their own political discussions rather than kind of your quite shallow solidarity.
Okay, and there's someone in front of you. If you just want to pass it in front of you, just if you want to speak.
I'd like to bring this back to the campus and remind you of the importance of academic freedom, because it's academic freedom that defines the university. And there's a strange consequence. If you're campaigning for academic freedom for any group through a ban, there's a peculiar logic to that. You lose the right to argue for academic freedom. Because academic freedom is an absolute. Free speech, no ifs, no buts. Academic freedom, no ifs, no buts. And you cannot, as a matter of logic, go on arguing for academic freedom when you restrict it in any way, because it is an absolute. So there's the irony. I can argue that BDS should be allowed, as I have in the past, to say what they want to say and argue against them. And I can argue for you, Palestinians to have the rights you've asked for, but you cannot anymore, either of you, or anybody who supports BDS, because you've abandoned academic freedom. And as far as the university is concerned, you've abandoned the university. And you do it, you can define it and redefine academic freedom as power, but it isn't. It's the right to speak your mind and challenge conventional wisdom. That's what it is, that's what defines the university, and both of you and all the BDS supporters have abandoned the university.
Okay, there's a couple more people right sort of, I think, in the back over there. Ella, do you want to, there's a couple of people, I'm kind of ignoring the sort of front row over here, so if you want to bring the mic, whoever gets it first. Yeah.
It's just an observation. The Glasgow Media Group did a very interesting study a few years ago about graduates' perceptions of the nature of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And they found that the majority of graduates actually profoundly misunderstood who had occupied the occupied territories. They got it the wrong way round. And I think that's interesting because it does illustrate, I think, why it's so important to put the stress on freedom of speech and engagement with people who you might disagree with, because there is actually a profound ignorance of the nature of that conflict. And that's why I think we, in this instance, it's particularly important to encourage freedom of expression and debate between all sides of this, so that our knowledge might be increased on this.
Okay, who's got the mic? Yeah, down the front.
Yeah, Barnaby really liked his facts, so here's one for you, for academia. A lot's been made of academia and stopping people with free speech. There's 347 academics that signed the boycott resolution in universities. Do you know how many academics there are? Okay, there might be a few more now, but do you know how many there are in the country? There's 194,000. So how much impact do you think that's really having? I can tell you that Israeli speakers have not been stopped from speaking on campuses here, apart from on a handful of campuses. In terms of your facts, Si, you've said that the Palestinians want it. Who wants it? The president of the Palestinians doesn't want it. Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want it. Number two, the Palestinian people have not called for it in a majority. Number three, did the 500 Palestinians that lost their jobs in the factory in the West Bank because you called for it on one of your only handful of wins as BDS, did they want it, those people that lost their jobs in the West Bank? No, they didn't. I know they didn't. And finally, I would like you, Barnaby and Si, to say if you believe in the right of the existence of the State of Israel, because as we know, BDS is agnostic on the existence of the State of Israel because they do not believe in it, because they do not believe in the right of self-determination of the Jewish people. So you are representing people that do not believe in the right of Jews to have their own land and to have Israel. Thank you.
Okay, there's someone in the middle over there who's been very patient in the kind of grey top with the red.
Yeah, hi. Where to begin, really? First of all, Joanna's speech in the beginning, like virtually everybody who defends the attacks on BDS, she managed to talk for several minutes without mentioning Palestine. This is a campaign about justice for Palestine. Si and Barnaby have eloquently explained that censorship is what governments do when they ban people from expressing themselves in fights against oppression. Boycotts, with one or two exceptions, which I won't go into, I'm sure Si and Barnaby can take it up, have been historically a tactic as part of a strategy to liberate people who are victims of slavery, racism, and oppression. Boycotts of West Indian Caribbean slave-produced sugar. The eponymous boycott of rack-rented Irish tenants against Captain Boycott under the British rule in Ireland. The campaign of Gandhi against British domination of the salt trade in India, and of course South Africa. Now, according to Joanna, none of these are acceptable campaigns for freedom. Mandela, please don't quote Mandela. Please don't quote Mandela. Okay, he was a supporter of Palestinian rights. Desmond Tutu.
Okay, can you either get the question or the point in, please?
I'm making a point. Desmond Tutu and Ronnie Castrils, a Jewish member of the African National Congress, are active supporters of the Palestinian boycott movement. Please, don't act as if Palestinians were some kind of state power, viciously suppressing poor little Israelis. The Israeli state uses Cultural means, here's a booklet, you can buy off me, the case for a cultural boycott of Israel.
Advertising pictures are now
Cultural ambassadors are everywhere.
Would you let the person behind you speak,
And the
please?
three of us are Jews, and we're telling you this. Please listen. Freedom of expression for Israeli cultural and academic ambassadors to reach us with a pack of lies. That is nothing to do with what freedom of expression should be about. It's cant. And the people who espouse it are just supporters of Israel's right to ride roughshod over Palestinian rights. Thank you.
This is not helping either case, all right? Okay, there's a person behind you who I know is going to make a nice, short, sensible contribution, which is going to really enliven the debate for both sides to answer. Go.
Hi, this is just a quick question for Barnaby. I thought you spoke very well, but you mentioned at the end that a lot of the anti-BDS people are conflating all Israeli individuals with the Israeli government. I mean, surely the obvious argument is actually the opposite is happening. And I'm particularly interested, we're both at the same university, we've both seen what's happened with Oxford University Labour Club. In fact, yesterday, when my friend Alex stepped down because of rife anti-Semitism, the issue seems to be, and this is my question, do you not think that there is almost ubiquitous conflation amongst the BDS movement of anti-Zionism and political protests against the state of Israel with rampant anti-Semitism? And if so, how would you tackle that within the movement?
Good, that's a modern way of asking a question. I'll just say there's a gentleman who's just behind that one, just right there. Then I'll come back to the panel. Then I'll go. Someone with the mic as well.
Hello. Hi. Okay, this is quite multifaceted, but it does have a question mark at the end of it.
Make it very brief. Then,
okay, I'll try. I'm gonna go ahead and try and agree with everyone on the panel at the moment. I definitely think the point that was made by Joanna, that Israel is not unique in terms of what it's been doing in Palestine, that's definitely true. There are countries that are guilty of similar crimes. I personally don't believe that absolves Israel of those crimes. I think that necessarily means that we should perhaps be applying a similar sort of... I'm personally a political cosmopolitan, so I think these sanctions as international sanctions should be used against any country that breaches fundamental, what I believe, or human rights or crimes against humanity. Nevertheless, I think that it might be useful here to make a delineation between international economic sanction and academic freedom. Obviously, I am not necessarily pro or for Israel. I don't think it's useful to be pro or for a country. It's obviously the point that was made just now about conflating all Israeli academics and believing that if we can boycott all of them is not conducive to academic debate. So I was just wondering, would it perhaps be useful to start talking more about kind of enshrining this idea of what was in the previous debate about all ideas being questioned on university campuses, and leave aside this idea of debating about the validity of international economic sanctions against Israel, and whether we should be focusing on the kind of subject of this conference, which is about ideas and speakers and no platforming and safe spaces, or not really safe spaces, but no platforming in universities, and whether that would be good for continued discussion and not shouting.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll take that guy with the blue shirt, and then I'll come back and we'll try and go out for some more questions.
I thought all three speakers were very, very impressive, and I'm very, very sympathetic to the Palestinians, but I think for me, I go with Joe. But there's one question, Joe, you're very convincing, but there's one question I want to throw out, which might be sacrilege to some people. Is what we call academic freedom an absolute question mark? And what I mean by that is when Sai and others make the point about the structure, materialism, politics, you make a point yourself, Joe, that boycotting is a tactical decision, so it's not necessarily a principle. Might it be the case that in other circumstances and situations that when people want to defend what they call academic freedom, we might say actually it's fair game in the bigger picture of a political struggle?
Great. Okay. One or two things to pick up on. Sai, do you want to?
I mean, SOAS, yes, I am. I'm involved in many campaigns. I don't think it's just a history, by the way. I think it's a mistake to think SOAS only has a history of collaboration with Empire. I think the way it is extremely close to NGOs today, there's a lot to continue, what's often been called neocolonialism and the continued ways of keeping global South countries under the boot of Europe. I'm part of many campaigns that try to address that at SOAS. I invite you to join us at our next meetings, and I'm sure you'll have very interesting contributions to make. Who has called for the boycott? 170 civil society organizations in Palestine who, unlike the president of the Palestinian Authority, were actually elected and don't use the Israeli army to massacre anybody who dares to elect the wrong people when they do hold an election. And yeah, I do decide to go with those 170 civil society organizations, and I think it's an impressive array of people. The continuous demand of do you not agree that it has a right to exist, I'm not sure what that means. It exists. It exists. Do I think South Africa should have continued existing as an apartheid state? No, I didn't. Do I think Israel should continue to exist as an apartheid state? No, I don't. And then finally, on the question of why don't you boycott everybody else? I mean, how far have we fallen? If we had this debate 40 years ago, we would have heard about the light on two nations, about the incredible progressive role that Israel was playing in the dark region, dangerous, that was coming to eat us all. We would have heard about the fantastic things that it did in blooming the desert. The best thing we can say now is other people massacre civilian populations. Other people force displacement and push people out of their homes. Other people take civilians as legitimate targets. Other people have race bars and racially motivated laws. This is the best that we can do now. And so I think we should take a step back and actually listen to ourselves. We all agree that what's happening to the Palestinians by the state of Israel and its continued colonial expansion is unacceptable. But what we're discussing on is whether we should extend our solidarity to a civil society that is asking us to do so. My answer to that is very simple. Of course we should. And if we can't even muster collectively the possibility that maybe there is something progressive or defensible about how Israel is behaving with the Palestinians, then I think the answer is in front of us. It's time to join Palestinians in the struggle for their freedom and to answer their call for solidarity.
Okay. Joe?
Okay, I just want to come back on a few of the points that were made down there, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to have some points that are kind of against me to respond to, so thank you very much for that. There was one sentence that you said in particular that really summed up for me why I think Western liberals love the Arab-Israeli conflict. And you said we need boycotts to liberate people. And to me, that implies that Palestinian people are victims, that Palestinian people will never be able to liberate themselves, that Palestinian people are there to be patronized by Western elites who love nothing better than to have victims to cherish. And it's for this reason that the Western campaign to boycott Israeli universities, cultural boycott, divestment and sanctions, it's for that very reason that it holds Palestinian people as victims, that it will actually never, ever be successful. And I think you can illustrate this point very, very well by really looking at this comparison that's drawn then between South Africa, and I think it is such an inappropriate comparison to draw. I'll pick out 4 reasons why I think it's an inappropriate comparison to draw. 1, it trivializes apartheid. And I think that is the worst reason for comparing Israel to South Africa. I think it completely trivializes apartheid. 2, the South African regime, the apartheid regime, was not actually brought down by boycotts. And I think putting out this idea that boycotts can be successful in bringing down a regime, again, it undermines the role that black South Africans played in actually ending apartheid. Reason number 3, I think what was going on in South Africa was you had an opposition movement. You had black people opposing apartheid, and the campaign for boycott actually supported the opposition movement that was on the ground. What we've got going on in Israel today is actually the complete opposite of that. There are calls for a campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions to bring about an opposition movement on the ground, and that's a fundamentally different thing. Fourthly, finally, the boycott campaign in South Africa was essentially economic. It wasn't cultural. It wasn't not just cultural, but fundamentally there was an economic boycott going on as well. Whereas the boycott campaign against Israel is far more cultural than it is anything to do with economics. Not exclusively, but far more cultural than economic, and for that reason then it's essentially it's an act of symbolism, and it's an anti-Semitic, bigoted act of symbolism and prejudice, rather than anything which can in any way hope to meaningfully bring down, or I mean, because let's be honest, that is the intention, to bring down the state of Israel. It's not going to bring down the state of Israel, but it is going to propagate anti-Semitic belief, and I think the incident at King's College is a very nice illustration of how this plays out in practice.
Okay, Barnaby?
Thank you. First, on the analogy with South African apartheid, it's important to recognize that this analogy doesn't come from Sai or me. It doesn't even come from Omar Baruti and the BDS National Committee. It comes from the African National Congress. It comes from the South African Communist Party. It comes from the people who liberated South Africa, who have been extremely clear. It comes from Desmond Tutu, respected international figures, but who've been extremely clear that Israeli apartheid is akin to South African apartheid, and who have also supported the movement for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions with very strong terms. So if we're listening to those who liberated South Africa, I think we should take them seriously. And in terms of the view that South Africa wasn't just liberated by sanctions and boycotts, that's absolutely right. I believe that Palestine, if it is liberated, will be liberated by the agency of the Palestinian people. But the question is, what role can we serve as an international community in showing solidarity with that struggle? And that's where the BDS movement comes in, just as the anti-apartheid movement all around the world played such a heroic role in helping to boycott South Africa. Secondly, on the question of academic freedom being an absolute, how can you claim to support academic freedom when you support banning some people? I mean, I just say this. When we imprison people to defend all of our freedom, we accept that the goal of freedom as an end sometimes requires difficult measures in order to ensure that everyone can be free and safe. And that is true in politics so much more generally, right? So when we say that we want everyone in Palestine, whether they are Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whatever, to be free, we understand that currently there is a state which is systematically undermining the academic freedom of millions of people, denying Gazans the ability to go abroad for scholarships, bombing their schools and universities, stopping schools and universities being constructed. And so we have to, if we care about academic freedom for everyone, we have to take a stand, and that might involve not collaborating with institutions that are complicit in that occupation, just as when we imprison people, we do that. On the state of Israel, I want to answer this question directly, which is always asked, do you believe in the rights? Isn't this just about delegitimizing Israel? As far as I know, and I might be wrong, but when I last checked, the majority of members on the BDS National Committee are in favor of a two-state solution. BDS has 3 aims. It's about right of return for Palestinian refugees, ending the post-1967 occupation, and equality for Palestinian citizens within Israel. Whether you support a two-state solution or a one-state solution, whether you support the existence of an exclusively Jewish state in part of Palestine or not, is up to you. Those are the 3 goals. I personally support a single, secular, democratic state within the whole of Palestine with equal rights for everyone. I don't support a racist law of return which says I as a Jew can go and live there, but Palestinians kicked out of their home 60 years ago can't. I'm being honest, that's my personal view. Lots of supporters of BDS have different opinions. Now, finally, I want to address this point that Ellie raised from Oxford about the conflation that goes on between Israel and Jews, which is a really, really worrying conflation. And KCL is another good example that people are using. So there was a meeting of the Oxford University Labour Club a couple of days ago now, was it? Was it last night? I can't remember now. A couple of days ago. 2 days ago now. Where they voted fantastically to support Israeli Apartheid Week. And after Jewish students spoke in favor of that, as did Palestinian students. One of the Palestinian students who spoke in favor was kind of shouted at in the meeting, which is pretty disgraceful, but the motion passed. And after that happened, the co-chair of the club resigned, citing anti-Semitism. And the examples that he gave, now I should say I wasn't in the meeting, neither I think was Ellie, but I've spoken to people who were. The examples that he gave in his statement were that people used the word Zio, short for Zionist, which he said is a word used by the Ku Klux Klan to mean Jews. Now I'm sure that's right. But it's also a word used by Palestinians and their supporters to mean Zionists. So when he says anyone who uses the word Zionist really means Jews, that's a very damaging conflation. I mean, it's a laughable conflation. Louise Mensch, people might remember, tweeted that she was going to block anyone who used the word Zionist. Someone asked, would that include Theodore Herzl? She said yes. Well, he was the father of modern Zionism, the father of the State of Israel. It's a ridiculous conflation, and it's ridiculous whether it comes from supporters of the State of Israel or opponents. Those of us who are anti-Zionist Jews have been fighting for years to say, don't conflate Israel and world Jewry, and we beg both the we don't beg the anti-Semites, we fight them, but we beg the Zionists to stop making that conflation. But just one very, very final thing, very, very quickly, which is you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't both say that Israel isn't all that bad and then say, well, Israel might be bad, but lots of other places are really, really bad too. That's an argument against doing anything politically ever, because the moment you pick one campaign, the argument is, well, why aren't you fighting all those other battles? Equally, you can't both say that Palestinians shouldn't be treated as victims, that they should be agents in their own liberation, and then speak against, passionately oppose, one of the strategies that the Palestinian people in their trade unions, in their civil society organizations have called for their liberation. BDS is one such strategy. I don't think they're victims. I think they're agents in their own liberation, and that's why we should support them.
Okay. You may not be able to have your cake and eat it too. There is going to be a coffee break. I don't know if there's going to be cake after this. I'm going to take one final, very brief round of questions. I'm really particularly keen to hear from particularly current students in the room, which I think is quite important. That's the purpose of this discussion. I'm also going to politely suggest to people that you may want to give your 10-minute thesis on how to solve the Israel-Palestine question. Most people will not be thinking, oh, wow, this person changed my mind. They're going to think they're delaying me from the coffee break. So keep your points very brief, very quick. There's a gentleman who had his hand up towards the back, or someone at the back, just right in my line of sight. And there's a couple of people over there. And then we'll see if and there's a couple more people moving forward.
Yeah, there seems to be a contradiction in the BDS view, which is that they say they're fighting for the little guy against power structures, but then they immediately turn around and try and take away the protection the little guy has from the powerful. And that protection is freedom of speech and is academic freedom. And you can see this happening right now. As soon as you take it away, the more powerful people say, that's great, we can now move against this. And we see this with the British government, who is undoubtedly far more powerful than BDS, turning around and saying, we're going to outright ban you by the power of law. This is why we need freedom of speech and academic freedom, not just for the people we agree, but for the people we disagree with as well.
Okay, there's another person in the blue shirt kind of along the row from you, I think.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to say that, I mean, it just seems to me it's very ugly and complicated what's going on. It seems to me there's a lot of strong opinions and a lot of sides. When I was on my gap year, right, I met 10 Israelis who'd just come out of national service, and I don't like to think that I wouldn't have chatted with them, tried to discuss things with them, and just have it out with them, or think and have a beer and just try and discuss. And I mean, that's all I really want to do. And I mean, economic sanctions aside, I don't want to just have it out with them. Surely that's what I wanted. I wanted to do that, and I enjoyed that.
Okay, I think there's someone who's just behind you. I think it's got the... just behind that chap.
I just wanted to ask Joanna that she talked about how we can't treat Palestinians as victims. We've got to treat them as agents in their own liberation. But then she told us that we can't support BDS, which, as we've heard, is supported by the Palestinian civil society. Presumably, she doesn't support Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and organizations like that. And we've seen negotiations over the last 25 years have resulted in successive loss of Palestinian land and sovereignty. So how does she want to liberate the Palestinian people, if not by listening to their own ways of liberating themselves?
Okay, and then there's the person just in the doorway there. You want to pause it? Ella, can you just bring it down to the person right in the front, just down here?
This is for Sai. You're talking about the best things that you can say about Israel at this point in time. And I think that the best things we can say about Israel are that for all its faults, it is a democracy, it has pluralism of religion, it has a secular curriculum, women can walk out in the street, wear what they like to the beach, etc., etc. These are values which are quite scarce in that region. And the BDS movement, what it's doing is it's denying things which are the best tools we have for reforming countries, which are dialogue and trade.
Great. And I'll just take this right down the front, and then I'm going to come back for final summaries because we're also running out of time. So.
I'd just like to say, firstly, I think there's an element of collective guilt within institutions here. So I think we're saying because there's elements of Ben Gurion University that puts the civil service there for their work on maternal health in Africa, their work on stem cells is inherently irrelevant. I don't think we can hold people who work in certain parts of Israeli universities responsible for their counterparts in different departments. I think it would be wrong to do so. And just very briefly, secondly, I think when we say that we don't want to hold Palestinian universities to different standards, we should be right in that. Like Birzeit University, which my Edinburgh University is twinned with, bans Jews on campus and has homophobic policies. Now, I think we should be set, when we say we should stand in solidarity with Palestinian universities, we should take a look at them morally and say, if we apply those standards to Israel, we should apply them to Palestinian universities too.
Okay, and just because I've generally ignored them, there's a person up the top who's just going to have to bellow their point because there's no microphone. So. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you to kind of do some final remarks and kind of final responses. I think, just to be fair, I'll ask you to speak in the order that you originally spoke in. So in that regard, Barnaby, if you could.
Sorry, I wasn't expected to go first. What to say? I mean, I think if there will be consensus on one thing in this room, it's that you've already heard too much of me. So, maybe to start by responding to this sort of Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East idea.
You're going to have to be quite
right.
short.
Okay.
Right,
Sorry. Just very quickly. 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza don't have the right to vote, and there are systematic inequalities facing Palestinians within the state of Israel. If you don't believe that Israel should be a Jewish state, then you're not allowed to even stand for election to the parliament, which is why there are routinely Supreme Court challenges to... Sorry? Which is why there are routinely challenges to the right of people like Hanin Zouabi to even stand for election to Israel's Knesset. So it's not a wonderfully democratic place. That's a last kind of angry retort. Let's finish by saying thank you so much to Spiked for having me. It's always wonderful to debate these things, and I hope we have today had more light than heat.
Si?
Look, I think this is exactly why Israel is in trouble. It's the only democracy in the Middle East if you happen to be a Jewish person living anywhere in the world. If you're a Palestinian living under their military rule or the over 54 laws that discriminate specifically against Palestinians that happen to be citizens of Israel, it's not so democratic. It defends religious freedoms about as much as the Ottoman Empire did. Actually, it has kept the Ottoman laws on religious minorities, which keep them, as is generally accepted in academia, oppressed but protected. And finally, on the secular state, well, it's a straight secular state in which the Rabbinical High Court has the right to influence all sorts of policies, including the right of return, how people get married, the kind of people that are considered to be able to become citizens or not. In final note, I'm absolutely in favor of the economic boycott, and I think it's going rather well. The fact that the Israeli government is estimating that in the next 10 years, the Israeli government is going to lose, the Israeli state is going to lose $4.7 billion because of boycott activity, is a sign that the economic boycott is doing rather well. As on the question of who is going to liberate Palestine, I'd like to full-heartedly join Joanna and to say that the Palestinians will need to liberate themselves and that I stand in full solidarity with their struggle to do so. In the context of that struggle, as they call on the international community to join them, not to liberate them. I think a BDS activist who believes they're going to liberate Palestine, I think would be deeply misguided. But indeed, to help in that effort to limit the economic and political support that Israel is receiving from our own governments, and therefore, in contrary to what people have said here, not ignore our own governments. We are taking on our own governments. We are taking the complicity of our governments, of our local councils, of our university in a particular situation. It's not only a question about what's happening over there, it's about the democracy and the political questions that we are trying to address here. So absolutely, all power to the Palestinian people and their struggle to liberate themselves, and I hope you will join us in taking part in the struggle in the way they asked us by joining the BDS movement. Thank you very much.
And Joanna.
I think it's kind of very symptomatic of the censorious climate that we're living in at the moment, that as soon as the words came out of my mouth in my opening remarks that Israel is not exceptional and that other countries carry out similar atrocities, that even as those very words were coming out of my mouth, I kind of knew that the retort would be, well, yes, we should also campaign against and restrict the freedom of speech from people from these countries too. So I just to kind of clarify, the person at the back who raised the question, is academic freedom an absolute value? And I didn't answer that last time. Yes, I think it is. I do think academic freedom is absolute. And I think it's really unhelpful that BDS is lumped in with academic freedom, or academic freedom has become a part of BDS, because I think, to go back to what I was saying earlier, BDS is a tactic, it's not a principle, and it conflates lots and lots of different things, academic freedom being just one of those things. But I think, you know, wherever around the world there are things, and nation states and politics and ideas and views that we don't agree with, I mean, my most fundamental belief would be that academic freedom is exactly what allows us to discuss and debate these ideas. So restricting academic freedom, and you know, I guess what's been illustrated very, very nicely is the logic of that, putting political judgments on who gets the right to speak, because that's exactly what would happen. No one would speak to anyone. You know, knowledge would not advance. We would not be we would go back to the Dark Ages, because we would just not communicate with anyone from any country around the world. As soon as you start saying you have to be holier than thou in order to be able to express a view or to engage in academic debate, well, you know, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. We'd all go home now. You know, on the whole kind of Arab-Israeli conflict, I've got to confess, I'm not an expert on what's going on in Israel-Palestine, but because I do believe in academic freedom, and I've got very strong views on BDS and academic freedom. In terms of the minutiae of what's going on in the conflict, one thing I do know is that whatever the solution is eventually to the Arab-Israeli conflict, it will not come about by either Israel or Palestine being a plaything of the West, being a political football, being something for people in the West to express their own, emote over and express their own political views, project those onto it.
Okay, can we just thank the panel just generally for taking part?